and join our efforts to advocate for change in asylum policies for LGBTQI+ refugees and asylum seekers across Europe. So I will introduce myself. My name is Leonidas Galeridis, and I work in advocacy, engaging with the EU Parliament on behalf of Safe Place International, with the goal to raise awareness and ensure sustainable policy interventions on behalf of LGBTQIA+ refugee community. So I will tell a few things about SPI. I will introduce SPI. Safe Place International is a non-profit organization that supports the protection, stabilization, and self-actualization of LGBTQIA+ and single mother refugees and asylum seekers across 7 countries globally. Safe Place International spearheads a unique leadership development program called the Dream Academy for queer refugee community across the world and has conducted these programs in both English and French. We currently provide basic needs, housing, and sustainability to the queer refugee community and supported 3 shelters and safe houses globally. Safe Place International also leads multiple research initiatives annually and develops 2 research reports in 2021, of which one is the research which we will talk about, a comparative study of asylum policies for LGBTQI+ asylum seekers in Europe. So we'll say a few things about the research itself. In June 2021, the research team at Safe Place International with Avery Pollington, Annie von Savanne, General Riobello, Morgan Bizian, and Marie Dufausset, which I think she's also attending today, developed a comparative study analyzing asylum policies for LGBTQI+ asylum seekers in Europe. This study was created with the real voices, stories, and experiences of LGBTQI+ refugees, asylum seekers, and others that are part of the asylum system in EU countries, focusing on Greece, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, and the Netherlands. With this study and its recommendation, we aim to advocate for systemic changes in the asylum system so that it is responsive to the unique needs of LGBTQI+ asylum seekers and for the protection of their rights and at every stage of the asylum process. This research launch is also meant to actively engage EU citizens in line with the conference series of the future of Europe, a unique opportunity for citizens to debate on Europe's challenges and priorities. So we'll start introducing Justin Hilton. It's a founder and executive director of Safe Place International to share his opening remarks. And I will just introduce him. Justin is an entrepreneur, writer, passionate activist, personal growth, and spiritual leader who is deeply committed to social change. Justin spent 2 decades working in India, Nepal, Cambodia, Bangladesh, Turkey, and Mexico on LGBTQI+ transformational work focused on combating oppression and advocating for inclusion. In 2018, he founded Safe Place International, which represented the coming together of his experience as a philanthropist, human potential leader, and passionate defender and supporter of marginalized communities. His goal is to create the LGBTQI+ refugee leaders of tomorrow who can advocate for themselves and their communities by being at the center of all decisions that affect them. We are so grateful to have Justin provide an insight into the motivation behind our research launch and the importance of building a better world for the global refugee community. Hello, Justin.
Hello, and thank you so much, Leonidas, to you and the incredible team that has worked tirelessly for over a year on this research project. And thanks to everyone that's showing up. It's so great to see your faces and names. And I know that each one of you, even in this moment, is probably typing away on behalf of the community members that we represent. And it's deeply touching to our team that there are so many people on this call and not on this call that are committed to advocating for LGBT refugees, that know their stories, that have looked in their eyes, and that are standing with them always. So thank you for being here this morning. This is a political action to stand together and to look to see what we can do and what is the next action to take. I mean, I know growing up gay in Texas in the US, I had no idea that there were people out there fighting for my rights. And when I started to discover that, I was so excited to find some of the amazing LGBT activists who paved the way so that I could have a husband and children and do this work in safe place. One of our modern day heroes is actually sent us a message this morning, just this morning, and that's Cyrus Integer. And such an amazing force. I was watching videos last week of him 17 fighting for LGBT rights. And Cyrus was one of the pinnacle forces in establishing the LGBT freedom zone in the EU, and has been such an advocate, not just of our community living in the EU, but those arriving who are most vulnerable and who have fought the hardest and given up the most for the dream of just being able to be who they are in a place that says they can be, and they can be safely. So with that, let's all open our minds and our hearts to Cyrus.
Hi, my name is Cyrus, pronouns he, him, and I am a member of the European Parliament from the smallest member state, Malta. I want to start by thanking Safe Place International for inviting me to give a few words at the start of this event. The event commemorating the research launch of a comparative study on different LGBTIQ asylum policies across the European Union. I am very honored to be able to share a few words with you today because this is a topic which I feel very strongly about. I am a gay man, and I am a proud gay man, but I grew up in a place which kept trying to convince me that I shouldn't be who I am, let alone be proud of who I am, and all this due to my sexual orientation. Today, the country where I grew up and the country I am elected to represent in the European Parliament is very different from back then. Today, we boast the best LGBTIQ laws in the world. However, having been right in the midst of that change, I can say very clearly that it was a very big challenge to arrive where we are today. The road to equality for all countries is a big challenge. So until every person is equal, we must all play our part in at least ensuring that everyone is protected. Coming from this background, I understand what it means to both live with and without equal rights. And it is for these reasons that I use my place of privilege here in the European Parliament to raise consciousness about this very issue, the issue of international asylum protection for LGBTIQ persons seeking refuge. Being able to be who you are is a human right. This is recognized by the European Union itself. Just last year, through a European Parliament resolution, which I helped negotiate, we declared the European Union an LGBTIQ freedom zone. And that means freedom zone for everybody. From myself in Malta, to my friends in Hungary and Poland, to the LGBTIQ asylum seekers that come to Europe for safety and solace. Europe is a declared zone of safety for all of our community, a place where your sexual orientation is only an aspect of your identity and it is to be celebrated and not hidden. But truthfully, on asylum policies, Europe has not always been the torchbearer, and until today, there are various degrees of protection that you will receive as an asylum seeker if you seek protection on the basis of persecution because of your sexual orientation. And while the whole of the European Union may be an LGBTIQ freedom zone, not the same can be said for our asylum policies, due to fragmented, inconsistent implementation of the asylum acquis by some member states. Truth be told, simply not every country in the European Union will afford international protection to someone who is being persecuted for being LGBTIQ. I look forward to hearing more and reading more through the research that is being presented today. I expect that this report will help us understand the real stories of LGBTIQ asylum seekers and beneficiaries of international temporary or subsidiary protection and the experiences faced in our member states. And finally, I applaud you for conducting this research, as I am certain that it will contribute to helping decision makers like myself better understand the holistic picture when it comes to the LGBTIQ asylum seeker in the European Union. I wish you a great launch and a great event. Thank you.
Thank you, Cyrus. And I know for Cyrus and for each of us on this call, this is a policy discussion, but it's also very personal. These are not statistics. These are human beings, amazing, brave, courageous human beings who at SPI, we have learned have so much to offer in terms of their wisdom, their empathy, their creativity, and just their ability to lead and provide answers to how we can be together in a way where separation and oppression don't dictate how we come together and how we contribute together. So just to remind all of us what we are present to every day, so many people are leaving, Iran, Iraq, Congo, Uganda, Cameroon, after horrendous pain and trauma. Maybe they were outed and they were threatened by their own family. Maybe their grandmother or their mother was murdered when they were outed. But they've left their country not by choice, but by necessity for the protection of their loved ones or themselves. And they've left with the hope that maybe Kenya would offer a chance for them to simply be who they are. And they find that Kenya or Cape Town, wherever their next stop is, does not answer that dream. And so then they're told by smugglers or other people wishing to exploit them that Turkey is that place. And then all on the journey to Turkey, they experience all kinds of physical, sexual, emotional violation. Some don't make it as far as Istanbul. And then many make the brave journey, whether they're entering, Italy or Spain or Malta or Greece into the EU, believing that everything they've heard about the EU is true, that there will be due process, that there will be an embracing of who they are, that the rights that they've heard about since they began to hear that there was such a thing as being an LGBT person, that there could actually be a place where they could be fully expressed. Everything that they've heard up to that point is the dream that they come with all the risk to get to the EU's door. Unfortunately, what each of us know, from the front lines is that that's not what they experience. They don't experience a warm embrace. They don't experience an assessment of their vulnerability. They don't experience folks asking them why they left their country and understanding the background and the sensitivity needed for this community. They don't experience protective housing. Many times they are exposed to the same dangers that they face in their home country. They're put right with the people that were trying to kill them or harm them back in their own country. So we all know of the systematic failures, and we have some very solid recommendations. And what I want to say about those is that I think there's a level of apathy that many of us get when we go to human rights conference after human rights conference, and we all speak about what needs to happen, and it doesn't. And we know that that's not just a systematic failure. That means death for people who get a double rejection in Greece and are sent back to the countries where their government or their families will kill them. We know the implications of systematic failure. They're real and they're human. But I think what we also have to remember is that small changes make big impacts. And so the recommendations we're going to talk about can be implemented on a micro and a macro basis, and lives can change. We see that. We see hope. And we also see that the best source of guidance on how to implement those changes and how to combat the othering and the dehumanizing of refugees is this community itself. It's the leaders within this community that are rising up and saying who they are and what they need and what they bring. This is not a problem to be solved. This is not something that we need to manage. This is an incredible resource that the world has been waiting for, this population that is waiting to be seen and recognized and celebrated. So I'm very, very excited that each of our panelists brings a different perspective a different flavor that is both very personal and also very pragmatic in its approach. So thank you each for being here. And I just want to take a moment and extend our awareness and our hearts to all the people that each of us is representing on this call, all the people that we're fighting for, all the people that we have fallen in love and taken a job that pays a lot less than we can make somewhere else. And for some of us, it pays nothing. We do it for them, and we do it because they're worth standing for and they're worth fighting for. So thank you for being here, and I look forward to listening with you to the amazing panelists we have with us today.
Thank you very much, Justin, for sharing your insight on the real experience of LGBTQI plus asylum seekers. We are honored to have you all join us for the launch of the comparative study on LGBTQI plus asylum policy in Europe. We hope the human side to the asylum system can be highlighted in the next hour and a half that you spend with us. To moderate the panel, I would like to invite Ananya Ramani, the Communication and Advocacy Director at Safe Place International, whose efforts focus on raising awareness on the challenges, experiences, and the resilience of our LGBTQI plus refugee family.
Thank you so much, Leonidas, and thank you everybody for making this time to join us. We are very grateful to have all of you here. So we have brought together a distinguished panel of experts, and we're very fortunate to include among them members from our LGBTQI plus refugee community and others who support them at the grassroots level through the asylum process. So our panelists will share actual accounts of the distinct challenges that the LGBTQI plus community confronts during the asylum process. We invite all of you to join us in contributing lasting change in the lives of our refugee community by raising awareness on the information that's going to be shared and the solutions that are proposed by a panel of grassroots experts. To start off, as the first speaker on our panel, it's my great honor to introduce David. We've changed his real name for his safety. David is a gay asylum seeker from Cameroon, whose difficult path to freedom in Europe has made him a passionate supporter of the LGBTQI plus refugee community across the world. While waiting for his asylum application to be processed, he passionately supports the grassroots work of Safe Place International and makes sure everyone from his community feels safe, seen, and respected. Today, David will narrate his lived experiences as an LGBTQI plus asylum seeker, the challenges he has faced, and the changes he would like to see in the asylum system so others in his community do not face the same difficulties like he did.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is David, and I'm originally from Cameroon, but I'm living in Athens, Greece as an asylum seeker. Leaving my country to relocate to Europe was the last thing I ever thought about. But growing up and discovering that I am different from others, I had to leave. Life in my home country was like a hell, living as an LGBTQI man, as a gay man. I had to look for a safe place for myself. So I was brought to Turkey by a friend who introduced me to a friend who said he could make me come over to Turkey. When I arrived in Turkey, I discovered that Turkey was not as safe as I thought because I knew I was looking for a safe place, but it was very difficult. So back in Turkey, life was difficult. So we had nothing to eat. We had nowhere to go to. We were just around because it's a Muslim country, as you all know. Their laws are not in support of LGBTQI people. So when we arrived in Turkey, it was difficult, and we had to look for money to eat and to also pay for our rent. So we're forced to do many things that we never wanted to do them. Like I might say things I had never imagined. I had never imagined to do them. We had to go to the street. We had to look for men to sleep with for money. It was really difficult. So at one point, this same friend introduced me to a line. He said, there's a line, we call it a line. There's a line to pass through using the dinghy to come to Europe through Greece. I accepted to do that because I was really looking for a safe place for myself. Okay, risking my life, like going through a lot, like passing through the dinghy, through the Mediterranean Sea. We heard stories about people dying every day, like in the sea and so on. So it was kind of dramatic to me, like it was like a trauma to me. But at one point I said, yes, you need to look for that safe place because I want to be free to love whoever I want to love and be myself. I had to go to Greece. We did 4 hours, 5 hours, and we arrived Greece. So I was so happy when we arrived Greece. I'm like, oh, yes, I'm at liberty now. I could love whoever I want to love. I was so happy. Fortunately, not knowing that the police, they took us, we went with them, and we thought arriving at the camps, we're put in prison. They call it a closed camp, but it was like prison. Oh my God. I'm like, I thought I came here for freedom. I came here for liberty, and everyone would like welcome me. Like you need we have human rights here, and they're going to respect me for who I am. But I was locked up in prison. So I started asking questions like, why are we kept here? They said no, they are going to do your asylum. When you're in the camps, they'll put you there like for 3 months, and they hurriedly do your asylum demands, and they might reject you and they will send you back to Turkey. So with all this, I had trauma in me because I got messages from people who were already there before me. They were telling you, these people, they'll only do this, and after that, they will reject your case like very quick, and they send you back to Turkey. So that was when my trauma started. I'm like, oh my God, I don't want to go back to Turkey because I am who I am, but I pray these people don't send me back. Being in the camps, like in the closed camp, I was quickly noticed as an LGBTQI man because we have some futures that you must know. Like, you know, when you see this person is gay, you might some futures, like there are some things you know them. I got insulted from the straight people are I left back home, like I was running from them. I met them in the closed camp. They had to put us together. It was quite difficult for me because I got insulted from them, like, go away. They use names like, this one is a woman, you know, such words. And alone, I'm like, this is the same thing that made me to leave my country. And I'm still facing this same thing here. It was really difficult for me. Many times I had to cry because I got insults like, you are rubbish. You are not worth it. Like, they made mention of me being like, a sinner. So I never like on one bit like look at myself as a human being because I was still insulted. At one point, they usually use some words like, we're going to rape you since you've decided to be a woman, and so on. And something happened like that, and I had to report it to the authorities. But little or nothing was done. They were like, go back there, your friends, you just need to be there with them. I had to report this case to one UN worker who usually comes to check on me, and this lady, she tried to see that they start my asylum process like real quick. So when it arrived, when my being there, they started my asylum service, and I said what I said, like I left my country, and they saw me that I was vulnerable. They gave me a card, we call it the blue card, that permits me to go all over Greece and Athens. Like, they told me, no, what you told her is really, you are placed under vulnerability. I was vulnerable. I had to leave there to Athens with no money. It was very difficult. I was poor. Even the money I had to pay to come to Athens, I had to, I don't know how to call it. I had to sell my body, like to sleep with men to get money to come to Athens. No support from the government. When I came to Athens, I had to sleep in the street for about some days, which when I called back home, someone back home in Cameroon, like, hey, can you please help me with money because I don't have anywhere to stay. I am really like cold right now. It was really cold. It was winter. Staying back in the streets, like living in how they call in the gardens. They were in the garden. We're sleeping in gardens. So one friend introduced me to an organization that if I come to this organization, they're going to give me a safe place to stay since I am free. Living there still, we had to sleep with, we continue our work, like we call it a work, like sleeping with men to get money just to feed. It was very difficult. At one point, this friend told me there's an organization called Safe Place. It's for LGBTQIA people. Could you please come in and maybe let's go do our registration day? Maybe we might not know, they might give us food, and we're going there for food. When I arrived there, I met this beautiful lady called Paulina, and she introduced herself to me, and I introduced myself to her, and she told me what Safe Place is all about, and they said they were providing housing. I was like, oh my God, maybe I might be lucky this time around. I thought, Paulina, I need housing. Paulina said, oh, you need to put your name in the wait list because there are people in front of you who needs housing. Maybe when it comes to your turn, we are going to give you housing. I came back to the garden I was sleeping. I had a lot of food from Safe Place. I had food that I had never, like, since I left my country, I had never eaten before. These people helped me with a lot of things that day. So when I came, I was so happy. I'm like, okay, I'll be going there like time to time. Sometimes I go there and I take my shower and I eat, and I was so happy. Some 6 months later, I was called by one Mr. Joseph, who called me to tell me there is a program called the Dream Academy and that I should do the Dream Academy. It's a program for LGBTQI members. Me, I strongly stand behind my LGBTQI family. Like, okay, anything that belongs, anything for my LGBTQI community, I'm going to do it. I said, okay, if it's a program for LGBTQI, I'm going to do it. So when I did it, I came in. Firstly, believe me, I was going there for the housing. I was not going there for the Dream Academy. I was like, oh, if this program is for, if they're going to give me housing, I'm going to do the Dream Academy. I'm like, okay. When I started the Dream Academy, I had a lot of pain. I had a lot of trauma. Like sometimes I think about the past, like what I'd gone through, my life was. These people gave me a lot of love. Like they showed me love in the program, like the Dream Academy. They showed me love and content. Like I deserve to live. I deserve to love who I want to love. They were so sweet. So I said, okay, I'm going to be an assistant. When I graduated as a graduate from the Dream Academy, I said I'm going to be an assistant. Believe me, I got a job from these people. They gave me. Right now I'm the community director for Safe Place Greece, and my arms are open to every LGBTQI member who has suffered what I had suffered. I made a promise to myself, like none of them will ever suffer again, because what I'd gone through, it's a lot. For the asylum system here in Greece, it's really slow. I would like to make mention about since then I'd been asking for an asylum date coming in. They told me, yeah, you were going to do asylum claims. When I go to the asylum office, they always like go and wait. But I'm asking, okay, right now they just cut up everybody for about 4 months now. We don't have no allowances. We don't have allowance anymore. We go to their office, like the UNHRC card, we will need our card. They usually tell us we need to be housed by the government before they give us money. And they are housing us with other straight men. That is something that is very pertinent that I want to talk about, because it's really not good. These people, we are running away from them. You are housing us with them. We get all the insult, we get all the rejection. It's really difficult to stay with a straight man, because with the same insult that we were running away from, we get the same insult like every day. So I really think the Greek government needs to really stand up for this and see that they create a safe place for LGBTQI members, not like mixing everyone together, and also like providing services like maybe our allowances, because it's 5 months now, if not of Safe Place Greece. I don't know, maybe I will have been a professional prostitute, like sleeping with men or harlot. So ending it all, I would say I do appreciate Safe Place Greece, Safe Place International for your help, and thank you guys so much because it really hurts me. I really don't want to think about my past life, but thank you all for listening because the journey was not easy for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, David. We felt your heart and we were so moved by your journey. We really, in all this, we really applaud your resilience, and we are so grateful for the opportunity that we get to stand alongside you and learn from you every day in every way. On our panel, our third speaker is Guillermo Moran, who is an outreach caseworker dedicated to supporting LGBTQIA+ individuals seeking asylum in Athens. He has an in-depth knowledge and experience of contributing to the asylum process of several asylum seekers across not just Europe, but also Latin America. As part of the panel, Moran will highlight the difficulties faced by the LGBTQI+ asylum seekers during the intake procedure and in reception conditions. He will also introduce solutions to ensure that their rights and protections are guaranteed on arrival in Europe. Moran?
So thank you for everyone for being here. Thank you for inviting me as well. I'm really pleased to be here today. So as Sanaya already said, like the first thing I think is important is that we are talking about a global issue from an LGBTQ point of view, as well as from a refugee point of view. It's true that European Union is facing like a huge, I don't like it to call it crisis, I would say like flows of migration. But the first thing we need to understand is that it's not a European problem. We all know that Turkey is the country with most refugees in the world. We know that Iran is full of Afghani refugees as well. We know that there was a Venezuelan migrant crisis, huge around especially Colombia and Brazil. And a lot of these migrants are also LGBTQ, and they're facing the same problems as we are facing here in Greece, which is my case as a member of Safe Place Greece, but also all around the world. And there are a lot of organizations such as Safe Place International, which they try to do actually is to put together and to communicate all these members, which normally, from my experience, they feel really alone and they have no connections when they come to Greece, I would say, which is my example, or to Brazil as well. But yeah, we don't have to forget that it's a global issue. The second thing I would like to say is that the whole process has a big change of dynamics all the time. If we see how was Greece in 2009 in general compared to now, regarding the vulnerability issue exactly, meaning like what we are trying to see here, and I'm talking from a Greek perspective of view, but I can also talk from a Spanish one because I'm originally from Spain, is that we should start considering and we should start like increasing what we call vulnerability during the asylum process. And sexual orientation, even though it's in the European Union Directive in Article 18.4, is seen as like it's actually said that sexual orientation should be something considered when evaluating an applicant. We actually see, at least from Greece and my perspective, that is not. And this is one of the main problems. The change of dynamics from 2009. In 2009, there was not even considered single moms as vulnerables. Now they are. HIV positive members were not considered vulnerable. Now they are. So as a positive way of seeing it would be that the change of dynamics in all the asylum procedure in Greece, European Union, and the world is changing all the time, and that this kind of panels could make us see someday, like because of this change of dynamics, we can maybe make this sexual orientation something which is really important for the asylum procedure. Because what I wanted to say as an outreach caseworker is that as we consider, for example, war in our country, reason for us for asylum, why sexual orientation is not considered a reason to escape a country. That's the main issue I wanted to talk about. And that's the main thing that governments, especially Greece, which is the one I know, should start considering. Like, people are not only leaving their countries because of wars or because of violence or because of terrorist groups, they're also leaving just because of their sexual orientation. From my experience also, we can see that there are many differences regarding where these people come from. For example, sometimes these asylum seekers, when they come because they're escaping away because of their sexual orientation, we can see a difference between Persian members, meaning like Iran and Afghanistan especially, and sub-Saharan African members, which would be especially Congo and Cameroon, generalizing because there are more countries, but this is the most seen, we can say right now in Greece. Sometimes, as Justin said, it's just family. Like sometimes they just escaping from their family, their friends, they find out. In Iran, for example, it's illegal and your family can actually go to the police and tell that, for example, my son is gay. So it's like, it doesn't need to be always from a governmental point of view. It doesn't need to be always that in this state, sexual orientation or being gay or LGBTQIA is illegal. It could just be the family, it could just be cultural. It could also be related to religion, to any religion or values. Like, we need to understand that sexual orientation is definitely something really important to take into account in the asylum process. And I think like Safe Place International as a whole is a big example of how we need to work more on this specific topic. And also I wanted to talk about regarding the vulnerability thing, regarding the reception, how do they come? So in my example in Athens, of course, we all know Athens is a capital. Athens is the capital of a transit country. Most of the people come from hotspots, what we call hotspots, which would mean the refugee camps existing in the islands next to Turkey, which is how they normally go. Like, for example, some cases we heard in here. There are also a Cuban migration right now, which is also the change of dynamics I'm talking about. Now they are not only coming from Turkey, they're also coming from Cuba, doing the whole way to Russia because there's a free visa, and then coming through the north to Greece. And there's a huge wave of Cuban people coming since September. And the Greek government, for example, can't continue with their asylum procedure because there are no Spanish speakers in the EASO, or because there are no Spanish speakers in general, so they can't actually make the interview. I think the Cuban migration actually is really important for this panel, because most of these Cuban refugees are actually part from the LGBTQ community, and they come from the revolution, the demonstrations that happened last summer, in which there were demonstrations against the government. From that point to now, I'm receiving all the Cuban members to which I work with, telling that friends of theirs are getting in prison, or friends of theirs are getting like actually beaten up in the street just because of being gay. And it's true, a lot of this community, not only to Safe Place Greece, but to other organizations that we have contact from Safe Place Greece, a lot of them are actually from the LGBTQI community. So I think that's an important thing. And actually, the change of dynamics that now is Cubans coming, which geographically would be like amazing. Meaning like we always think that they come from Iran, from Afghanistan, from Syria. Then from 2019, we started seeing that they're coming also from Congo, from Cameroon, from Cote d'Ivoire. And now we started seeing that even from Cuba are coming to Greece, which obviously, like in most cases, their final destination is Spain. Mainly because of the language, but the same way we were seeing with Iranian and Afghanistan people that they wanted to go to Germany, which that is also changing as well, because in Germany now the refugee camps are starting to be like the hotspots Greece has right now. So regarding housing, another thing that we see a lot regarding the reception would be the thing that David and James talked about, the housing. In the asylum procedure in Greece, they always take into consideration first the country they come from, then the language they use, or they know the languages they know, and then some of their values, religion, and stuff like that. Taking into account an LGBTQIA perspective, maybe it should be more important to consider the sexual orientation of the refugees that you're going to house than the country. Because, for example, we can imagine that a person from Congo and a person from Cameroon, if they both speak French, which in most cases they do, they are both from the LGBTQIA community, they are going to get along better than the horrible situations that we just heard from James and David, that just because of being from Cameroon or just because of being from Nigeria, they get 5 of them in the same house. And of course, sometimes it can work, but unfortunately, many times it doesn't. And that is really important. So the main thing I want to say is that we should start considering sexual orientation as one cause by itself to ask for asylum, and start making the interviews to refugees from that point of view, and have it as an intersectional variable. The same we got it with gender, the same we got it with being single moms, the same we got it with a lot of other things, like in the whole asylum process, for the government, for organizations to always take into account the sexual orientation of the members or of the asylum seekers that are coming, in order for them not to have these horrible experiences that James and David were so strong to pass by. And actually, let's hope that someday that changes, and that at least, I'm talking for Greece and I'm talking for Athens, but I hope it would be at an international level, we start seeing that this change, and we start seeing that everyone takes more into account The fact of not only being a refugee or not only having all these problems and all these issues they already have, but also to take into account that unfortunately, being an LGBTIQ member right now as an asylum seeker is just worse than just being a refugee in most of the cases. And that should change from all the points of view, but especially regarding sexual orientation. So I think that's everything I got to say. Thank you so much for listening to me, and I'm willing and I'm waiting to hear all of my colleagues.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Moran, for highlighting the global aspect of the challenges faced by the LGBTQIA+ refugee community. And also thank you for covering so many points into the little time you had. We really appreciate that. So our next speaker on the panel is Richard Weiss, who is a project manager at the Human Rights Legal Project. He's extremely passionate about working with marginalized communities, and that's how he came into this field. In the past, he has combined his compassion and determination and he's worked in diverse roles as an immigration legal advisor, an emergency response officer, a care worker, and in other leadership positions with NGOs. He's now using this background he has in humanitarian action and in law to supervise and manage the legal team at the Human Rights Legal Project. At the launch, we really appreciate that we have him to share with us the challenges faced during vulnerability screenings and in the processing of cases for LGBTQI+ asylum seekers, with recommendations for change in policy and procedure, looking at it from real life experiences. Richard?
Thank you very much for organising the panel, introducing me, and thank you to the colleagues that have gone before me. So I think I'd like to speak from my own personal experience on the legal side of things, rather than purporting to speak about other people's experiences or the way I interpret those. So particularly with the way that the common European asylum system is constructed, there's a predetermination of vulnerability for LGBT people in the way that the law is written. But in practice, this doesn't really translate into protection standards, which we see as overwhelmingly needed. In terms of how the common European asylum system acquis is developed, there are sort of interlocking standards between the special reception, between the reception conditions directive, procedural guarantees, and vulnerability, and how these actually result in the creation of vulnerability in the system itself. And unfortunately, what this does is it doesn't really recognize people who are vulnerable, but instead it assumes people to be vulnerable if they're hitting specific characteristics. So if people are women, if people are over a certain age, if people are disabled. Now, that's not to say that these people aren't, of course, vulnerable, but the way that the law works is that it suggests that these people are inherently vulnerable, and then when moving on to people that might actually be vulnerable and require special considerations, it's almost a cumulative effect. So if you don't hit these particular characteristics that the law is expecting, you then fall out of how this procedure might work. So in my work and in my previous roles, a lot of the clients that we've had have been single men, quite often young single men, which unfortunately for those working in the sector, we know quite often that they get left out of programming and left out of opportunities. So in terms of where the law sits with that, the pregnant women, disabled people who are survivors of sexual or particularly violent assault, victims of torture, they don't hit any of these criteria. So the law assumes that single men are young, strong, resilient, able to survive. In the last 12 months for the Greek Asylum Service, I've seen decisions where people, the Greek Asylum Service has effectively said, we recognise that X, Y, and Z, where X, Y, and Z all demonstrate fairly horrific events in people's childhood and young adulthood, but then conclude, well, you're a young man, you're quite safe to go back to somewhere like Mogadishu, which seems really at odds with this idea of what it means to be vulnerable. There isn't really a way in the law as it stands at the moment to recognize how the intersectionality of a person as they are presenting, or the space, both legally and policy-wise, that somebody occupies. And I think that if you look at some of the decisions that some of the asylum that the asylum service has been putting out, and the way it subsequently treats people as they're going through the process, there's this real lack of consideration for how people move through the asylum system, both physically and procedurally. So what happens a lot is that when finally, I think as we heard earlier, that somebody was particularly vulnerable in one of the hotspots, so therefore given an open card, and then moves to the mainland, there's no real consideration that, you know, it's well documented that unfortunately when single men, for example, move to urban environments, the vulnerability goes up almost exponentially, and the risk of sexual and gender-based violence goes through the roof. So without this holistic idea of what vulnerability means and what a person does and experiences through the procedure, there's never really going to be adequate protection for people. So I think that when it comes to recommendations on a policy level, the idea of safe third countries, as well as the rest of the asylum procedure as a whole, really needs to take stock of the intersectional nature of people and plural identities, and the different stages, different presentations, different interactions, all of those reflect on how somebody may be vulnerable. The safe third country principle, some of the countries that are currently listed as inherently safe really fail to acknowledge a queer experience, because they're not safe. That's why they're fleeing in the first place. And this scripted, firm idea of the law in that respect, and then they fail to adjust reception conditions appropriately to acknowledge plural and diverse identities. It just creates a perfect storm, unfortunately, for a lot of our community members. There's a number of things going through procedure that really affects the way that community members go on to claim asylum. Things like shaming, things like medicalization, the way that evidence is produced, the way that evidence is requested, and all of these things again sort of fail to adequately acknowledge the way that men who have sex with men, LGBTQIA people, flee their countries, the things that they're experiencing, and then how they are then expected to prove that. I think love is quite a difficult thing to prove, and to ask somebody from an alternative culture to do that in Western terms, whilst also suggesting that they're not vulnerable if they don't hit Western and perhaps colonialist, shall we say, ideas of what being vulnerable is or isn't, is really, really restrictive. I think overall, the Common European Asylum System, it's still very much in its infancy. I think it's still emerging, and I think the Migration Pact, which, although having serious flaws already, I think moving things up from a directive basis up to a regulation basis there's a real opportunity actually to prevent the sort of deterministic and reductionist ideas on protection needs that are currently in place. I think finally, one of the things that could really go forward with the migration pacts is the Yogi Carta principles and in the interpretation of legal standards for human rights within an LGBTQIA plus frame. So principle 23 on the right to asylum, principle 10 on refoulement, which I think ties in quite well with the way that Greece has sometimes said that the safe third country principle, particularly with countries in Central Africa, that, you know, okay, you can go back to those countries and they're safe. Well, principle 10 of the Yoga Carta principles would suggest, well, no, actually that's a direct violation of the right to dignity. So I think in terms of legal developments, the Yoga Carta principles, reports like this and advocacy events are going to be really, really important to influence how we think about LGBTQIA people in a wider policy framework when we're dealing with asylum and refugees. So yes, I think that going forward, my policy recommendations would be about recognizing individual vulnerabilities, intersectional identities, plural people, and how they occupy those kind of spaces, and how decisions are made, and that those should be being made by people who are qualified and competent with regard to LGBTQIA issues, how they present, and how they're received in their home countries and in their host countries, should I say, rather than having them made by law enforcement officials and people that really don't have a firm place in determination procedures.
Thank you so much, Richard, for providing a perspective of the reality on the ground and actually translating some really technical and hard to understand laws and policies into easily understandable challenges that actually are faced during the asylum process. Moving on, as our next speaker, we have Matt Bartek, our extraordinary program director for Safe Place Greece. Prior to joining SPG, Matt dedicated his life to working with marginalized groups as a peer counselor, case manager, and a program manager with different organizations. His background in sociology and his personal experience of homelessness as a gay man shifted his focus on working to empower LGBTQI+ asylum seekers and refugees by leading our Moms to Moms and Athens Housing Collective when they were first set up. At the launch, he will share with us his invaluable insight on the gaps that exist in the asylum system, the needs of LGBTQI+ asylum seekers that remain unaddressed, and steps that are needed to ensure a holistic response to these challenges. Matt?
Hello, everybody. I'd just like to say thank you to all of the co-panelists and also for everyone who took part in this research, because it's really important. As some of you know, in Greece, there's very little statistics, if any, about LGBTQ asylum seekers, and this just goes internationally. The data is unfortunately not there, so it's really important that we have these types of research being conducted. It's important for me to also talk about double marginalization and what that means. So LGBTQ asylum seekers and refugees are marginalized in two ways simultaneously. So obviously they are refugees and asylum seekers, but then also they're LGBTQ. So they face additional barriers, and there's also more trauma that often comes with that. So it's like an extra layer of trauma and discrimination, which makes it hard for them to connect with other people from their home country. So they don't have that connection to social capital. So it makes things a lot more difficult. So talking about some of the gaps in the asylum system, the Geneva Convention unfortunately doesn't explicitly state that sexuality and gender are grounds for asylum status, and it only establishes minimum standards for asylum procedures. It's really important to look at this process because it creates a lot of more issues down the line. So it leaves this the decision about whether or not someone wants to add these into the member states and someone has a vulnerability, it leaves it up to these individual states. So there's no standardization around that. And sometimes in Greece, it's just whichever countries the Greek state has deemed as being safe or not, and it's based on their own analysis. So there is no standardization again. There are accelerated asylum procedures for people who are coming from Ghana, Senegal, Gambia, just to name some countries. And these often end up in negative decisions because they're already considered safe. However, some countries don't outright criminalize same-sex activities or relationships, but they have other ways of criminalizing it in a very, I guess, subtle way. So, for example, there's other discriminatory legislation through laws and legal practices. China and Turkey have what they call morality and decency laws. So that's another way to target people while not blatantly saying that they're homophobic. So there's some loopholes there that need to be understood and looked at. It's also very important to implement mandatory standardized training on LGBTQ issues and experiences. One of the main things that is really important in this work is what we call trauma-informed care. And that's providing care with the understanding that of trauma, that people have experienced a lot of harm, and we need to make sure that we don't trigger that, and we need to minimize the harm. So instead of asking what is wrong with this person, we're asking questions like, what has this person gone through? And obviously you can see how this is really important and how it can shift the goal of the asylum process, and like understanding and seeing people instead of saying like, what's wrong with you? It's a lot more, I'd say like holistic. And it's also important that people are also trained to understand the spectrums of gender and sexuality, and to be also culturally appropriate and competent. So using the right terminology, asking pronouns, understanding the difference between sexuality and gender, because sometimes staff who are in these positions who are doing these very intimate interviews are not trained to a high standard on how to deal with this type of situation. Also, sometimes it's important to note that the LGBTQ people themselves who are applying for asylum may not be at a point in their life where they're able to openly express this, especially if they're coming from a country that, you know, just even mentioning this will get them killed. So it's important to also understand the trauma that they've gone through and say like, okay, maybe this person doesn't have the terminology, but they know that there's something different about them. So maybe we don't expect them to say it in this way. Maybe there's a different way that they can say these types of things. Also, translation, making sure that translators are appropriately trained. And this is something that Moran stated as well. There's that influx of Cuban refugees in Greece, and it's creating a backlog because there's no translators. Also, there's been situations where I think there was mentioned by David or James that someone from the camp was used because they think they speak in the same language, they come from the same asylum seeker background. Unfortunately, sometimes information in those personal interviews are later shared with the community. And we've had multiple situations where people's safety were jeopardized because the translator shared that information and therefore their sexuality or gender identity was outed. And there were sometimes physical and sexual repercussions towards that. So it's very important to make sure that this training is all around for everyone who works with this vulnerable population. And it's also important to make sure that we're including LGBTQI folks in this asylum process. So educating them upon arrival about these vulnerabilities, some of these that Richard already talked about, being LGBTQ, being HIV positive, being victims of torture. And of course, with victims of torture, it's very difficult sometimes to get that proof because in Greece, they usually route you through the hospitals. So there needs to be other routes that people can get these certificates of torture to help their case. And it's also important to have lawyers who have been trained and are competent in LGBTQI situations, experiences, because often if they're not, sometimes people can be put off by that and then they're turned to other lawyers, which sometimes can scam them. So it's important to make sure that people are competent all around, and this training is standardized, like I said, and available to everyone. Also, this is something that's been echoed by David and James about the gender and sexually appropriate housing, the sexuality appropriate housing. If we have someone who is not LGBTQ and there's like 4 or 5 of them and you put one person who's extremely vulnerable and has faced harassment, it's just definitely not a good situation, as we've heard already. And it's important that James highlighted that already in the Netherlands and Germany, they're already creating situations and reception centers for people who are LGBTQI+, and that's really important, something to think about going forward. Another really vulnerable population is, of course, our trans folks. So it's important for them to get connected to hormones immediately when they get into the camps, because there's a lot of physical and mental repercussions that can happen if they skip their hormones. The same thing for people who are HIV positive. It's important that they have quick access to their medication to make sure that they don't have to go through any physical repercussions as well. So these are things that the asylum process can think of and have in their mind to better suit LGBTQI+ people that are coming through the system. Also, when it comes to societal integration, it's really important to think about what it's like to be LGBTQI in these host countries or the new home countries. So there's very few crimes that are reported as having taken towards LGBTQI people. And we see this a lot in our programs, specifically in the program that I've run. People don't want to go to the police because there's retaliation, there's fear of the police, there's concerns about how this is going to affect their asylum status. So, I mean, it leads them to a higher risk for sexual, physical, and labor exploitation and violence, which then leads to higher risk of homelessness. So it's a very vicious cycle. So it's important to think about how can we integrate LGBTQI people into their new home countries, and they deserve better support when integrating into these programs. So things such as job training and educational opportunities that are specifically catered to them, because not every single space where they can learn about jobs and education is safe to them. So it's really important to understand this, like we said, the double marginalization and how that affects their access to services. Something else that was also mentioned earlier is just heteronormative practices and beliefs guiding the asylum process. So for example, just putting the responsibility to LGBTQI folks to be able to have this language to express the fact that they're afraid and to like really use that to show that they're vulnerable, that's a problem. Also assuming that just because someone is masculine presenting that they don't identify as feminine. So like looking at the gender binary and not understanding the whole spectrum of sexuality and gender identity. There's also been cases of people who just aren't comfortable, expressing their gender the way that they really feel just because they've come from a country or they're living actively in the camp and it's just not safe for them. There's also been cases of LGBTQI people who haven't had sex or relationships with other same-sex people because their countries, it could lead to death. So sometimes those people are not believed to be LGBTQI+, and that's another heteronormative belief that it's important to challenge. There's also cases of, women who are lesbians who are being forced into a heteronormative marriage. And so then it's used against them because they were in that marriage. So are they straight? Or if they had a child in a heteronormative marriage. And so understanding that cultural background and the context in which that takes place is very important. And like I said before, just the full spectrum of sexuality. And this is where like the training really comes in to understand what it is and also what is culturally appropriate, because a lot of these things sometimes do come from a Western perspective. So it's important to also acknowledge that and to leave space as well. So those are the main things that I'd like to highlight. And I just want to say thank you again for being here and looking forward to a fruitful discussion.
Thank you so much, Matt. Thank you for sharing the daily challenges that actually occur in the lives of our LGBTQI+ asylum seeker community, and also for providing really practical solutions to resolving it. Our last speaker for the evening is Dan Chapman. He's worked very closely with our community members and their reality as the co-founder and project coordinator of the Samos LGBTQI+ group, a community organization supporting LGBTQI+ refugees and asylum seekers at the EU border in Samos, Greece. Dan, we would love to hear your comment.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, and I'll try to keep it quick so we've got some time for questions after I speak as well. The main thing that I want to highlight and that we constantly try to highlight as an organization is the basics that LGBT people arriving in Europe, the basic needs of safety are not met. So when someone arrives in Samos from Turkey, they're made to quarantine in a space with other asylum seekers who don't identify as LGBTQI+, and this has a whole host of dangers and risks. What we do know is that the majority of our members that live in the camp are survivors of sexual violence, survivors of torture. Most LGBTQI+ refugees and asylum seekers that we work with have mental health difficulties currently, or have had mental health difficulties because of their sexual orientation or gender identity before arriving in Greece. And the response from the authorities here in Samos really lacks any understanding of the unique needs of LGBTQI+ people. And there's very little response to address these needs. And I guess it comes from the wider EU policy of hostility, and that if you make people who have arrived in Europe suffer, then it will deter other people from arriving in Europe, which we all know is not the case. And then it means that the community that we work with face increased risk of violence, when what we get reported from a lot of our community members is that being forced to share containers with people who are not LGBT completely invades people's privacy and puts people at even more risk of further sexual violence again. In Samos, in the new camp, which is the model for Europe, LGBT people aren't even given separate containers or the option to choose who they stay with. They're not given keys to the bedrooms in which they're supposed to sleep in. And so there's no privacy, no intimacy. And for a lot of people, although they try to hide their identity from other people in the camp for their safety, it's impossible to hide your true self 100% of the time. And so, again, we see lots of discrimination and lots of stigma towards people. And to quote one of our community members, it's worse than often than some of the experiences that people had had before, because before, where you would just have your own community stigmatizing or discriminating against you, now you're in a camp where you have different communities from all over the world also placing the stigma and discrimination towards yourself. And you're faced with a situation where your hope was arriving in Europe and receiving protection and safety because you're LGBT, and Europe is meant to be this LGBT freedom zone. And that's not the case at the borders. And people then are made to face all this stigmatization where the authorities are very indifferent, and they ask for safety and they ask for their rights to be protected, as it should be in the EU law and the Greek law. And this doesn't happen. So what needs to happen is a complete rethinking of the reception conditions to LGBTQI+ asylum applicants that's separate from the accommodation structures to non-LGBTQI+ people. And it needs to be safe alternatives. As Matt said, there needs to be training for the authorities on how to appropriately respond to LGBTQI+ people and meet their needs. But the most important thing is that it needs to be in partnership with the LGBTQI+ communities that we work with. One of the things that we see in our organization is a lot of our advocacy work, the majority of our advocacy work and all of our recommendations about safety come from our community members themselves. And when we've been able to connect LGBTQI+ people from tens of different countries, from the Middle East, from sub-Saharan Africa, when we've been able to connect people and give the resource, the limited resource that we have, LGBTQI+ refugees are able to address their own needs or able to make suggestions or empower themselves. So we need to be able to put LGBTQI+ refugees in a position where we give them the resources and we give them the space to be able to address their own issues in an authentic way, rather than as often white Western Europeans or us as authorities saying this is what you need, giving LGBTQI+ asylum seekers the resource to be able to address their own needs and the space to be able to say to authorities, you're doing this and it makes us unsafe. This is what you need to do so we feel safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan, for providing that insightful perspective and for bringing it down to the very important point, highlighting that the LGBTQI+ asylum seekers and refugees know exactly what they need. And it's all a matter of just giving the power in their hands. Unfortunately, we don't have time for a Q&A session, but please feel free to send us any questions you may have, and we will work to send you an email with the responses from our panel. Before I move on to closing remarks, I just wanted to acknowledge two people who commented in the chat box, Kalki Subramaniam and Mahmood Goba, both who work with the LGBTQIA+ refugees and asylum seeker community. And I just want to thank them for all the support that they provide and for raising their voices and sharing their support for this community. It means so much to us. So I would now like to hand over to Leonidas for the closing remarks, and thank you all for joining us in the panel, and thank all the speakers for all their time, all their effort, and for providing such great insight into what actually happens on the ground. Leonidas? So from my side also, I would like to express our gratitude and appreciation to Honorable Cyrus Engerer for his continued support to the rights and the well-being of the LGBTQI+ asylum seeker community. We would also like to thank Jassy Hilton, under whose leadership Safe Place International has made tremendous progress in its support to the marginalized communities. We want to thank all our panelists for sharing their experience and insight on this topic, and for their tireless efforts in the protection of LGBTQI+ and the larger asylum seeker community. We would especially like to thank David and James for sharing their inspiring journey and the resilience they showed despite every obstacle they faced during the asylum process. We would like to thank also Barbara French, our beloved board member, for her continued guidance and support to the advocacy team at Safe Place International for the launch of this report. Our sincere gratitude is also extended to the entire research team, once again, for their passion and hard work. Safe Place International will continue its fight to ensure protection for the rights of all LGBTQI+ refugees and asylum seekers. We hope to achieve this through representation of LGBTQI+ refugees in all leadership roles and spaces where decisions to affect the rights of their community are being made. We hope this will create a future where they are celebrated for the unique human beings that they are. One way we are doing this is through our leadership program, the TRIM Academy, which supports the socio-emotional learning and employment training of our community, with 600 LGBTQI+ refugees joining us for the course in 2022 alone. If you would like to learn more about the transformational experience this course brings, join us to hear about our academic research on this course conducted by our academic partners at Adelphi University and the University of South Florida, Sarasota, Manatee. At this event on February 18, you can also directly interact with many of our LGBTQI+ refugee community members as they share with you their reflections on the course and the new direction it has created for the future. Thank you once again, and we look forward to seeing you at our event in February.
Thanks, everybody. We'd love to hear from you. So grateful to have all of you here. We're all about collaboration. Many of you are already collaborative partners. Let's be in touch. Let's support each other. This is hard work. It's the winter. Thanks so much for being